I learned early how to split myself in half. In public, I was just Nathan Reed, quiet, careful, easy to overlook. At home, I was a husband and a father of 3, and that role felt heavier and more real. Laura used to tease me, saying, "You carry the world like it might crack." I always smiled and said, "Someone has to." Emily Carter entered my life at work. She leaned across my desk one night and said, "You're different. You actually listen." I laughed and replied, "That's a rare skill now?" She smiled like she'd already claimed me. We talked late, too late. She asked, "Are you married?" I said, "It's complicated." That was my first mistake. At home, Laura asked, "You're late again?" I said, "Meetings." She nodded, trusting. Ethan shouted, "Dad, watch this." Lucas followed, louder. Mia tugged my sleeve. I stayed, but my mind wandered. Guilt sat in my throat. Emily started inviting me places. "Just networking," she said. "People respect a stable man." I replied, "I'm not your guy." She laughed. "You already are." I should have walked away. Instead, I followed. The night of the event, she adjusted my tie and whispered, "Relax." I asked, "Why am I here?" She said, "Support." Music swelled. Cameras flashed. Someone shouted her name. She grabbed my hand. I felt trapped. "This is my husband," Emily said, loud and proud. The room exploded with applause. I couldn't breathe. My ears rang. Someone asked, "When did you marry?" Emily squeezed my fingers and said, "Recently." I stared at the lights, thinking of Laura's face, of Mia's laugh, of Ethan's trust. My mouth opened. No sound came out. Emily leaned close and whispered, "Don't ruin this." I thought, if Laura sees this, I lose everything. I thought, if I speak, I destroy her. I said nothing. Silence wrapped around me like a verdict. After, I said, "Why would you do that?" Emily shrugged. "It helps my image." I snapped, "You lied." She replied, "You didn't stop me." That hurt more than the lie. Driving home, my phone buzzed. Laura texted, "Are you okay?" I stared at the screen. I typed, erased, typed again. I wrote nothing. That night, I stood in my kitchen alone. I whispered, "What have I done?" No one answered. I realized silence wasn't safety. It was betrayal. And it started with me. My phone rang. I didn't answer. It rang again. I said, "Hello." Laura asked, "Where are you?" I said, "On my way." She said, "I saw something." I asked, "What?" She said, "A video." My heart dropped. I whispered, "It's not what it looks like." She replied, "Then tell me what it is." I couldn't. She said, "Come home." The line went dead. I sat in the car and said, "Fix this." The silence laughed back. I knew then that one lie could split a life clean in two, and I had let it happen. I rested my head on the wheel and said, "I'm sorry." I didn't know who I met. I saw my kids' faces like ghosts in the glass. I promised, "I'll make this right," even as I knew promises were easy and truth was not. Somewhere behind me, applause still echoed, and ahead of me waited consequences I could no longer outrun. I started the engine. I said, "You did this." I answered myself, "You let it happen." Streetlights passed like judgment. I drove toward a home that no longer felt safe, knowing the man who walked in would not be the same one who left that morning. I tightened my grip and whispered, "This is where it begins." I didn't know how wrong I was, only that silence had already taken its price. The road stretched ahead, dark and unforgiving. I kept driving, carrying the weight of a lie that had finally learned my name. I didn't know it yet, but this moment would burn itself into every part of my life. And nothing after this would ever be simple again. I drove on, already missing the man I used to be. This was the first crack, and it would not be the last. I felt it coming. No. I didn't sleep after that night. I sat on the couch and stared at my phone. Emily called 3 times. When I answered, she laughed. She said, "Relax, it worked perfectly." I said, "You lied about me." She replied, "You didn't stop me." That sentence looped in my head. It sounded like blame dressed as truth. I hung up and whispered, "What have I done?" The silence answered me. At work, Daniel Brooks cornered me near the stairs. He said, "You look like Hal." I said, "I messed up." He asked, "How bad?" I told him, "I let a lie stand." Daniel shook his head and said, "Lies grow teeth." I asked, "What do I do now?" He answered, "Tell the truth before it bites." I nodded, but fear glued my mouth shut. At home, Laura barely looked at me. She asked, "Are you hiding something?" I said, "I'm just tired." She said, You've been tired for weeks. I had no answer. Ethan tugged my hand and said, Dad, play with us. Lucas added, You're not smiling. Mia hugged my leg and whispered, Don't go. I said, I'm here. But my voice shook. That night, Laura asked again, Who is Emily? I froze. I said, She's nobody. Laura replied, Then why is she calling you? I stared at the wall. Emily texted, Stop acting guilty. I typed, You put me in danger. She sent back, I gave you importance. I realized she never asked if I was okay. I lay awake replaying applause and cameras. I thought she used me. I thought I let her. The lie felt alive now. It breathed without me. Daniel texted, This won't stay quiet. I replied, I'm scared. He answered, Good. Fear means you still care. I stared at my ceiling and whispered, I'm losing control. The house felt heavier. Laura slept with her back to me. I said softly, I'm sorry. She didn't respond. I understood then that silence wasn't protection. It was a fuse burning. And I was standing too close. I closed my eyes and thought, This will explode. I didn't know when. I only knew it was coming. I whispered, I should have spoken. My chest hurt with every breath. I imagined Laura's eyes hardening. I imagined my kids learning my name from rumors. I sat up and said, I can't hide. The words sounded weak. My phone buzzed again. Emily wrote, Stop panicking. I replied, You don't get to tell me that. She answered, You owe me. I laughed, sharp and bitter. I said out loud, I owe my family. No one clapped this time. I finally understood the danger. The lie was growing. And it was hungry. I lay back down and stared into darkness. I thought of Daniel's warning. I thought of Laura's silence. I thought of Emily's smile. My heart pounded as I admitted the truth. I was standing on the edge. If I stayed quiet, I would fall. If I spoke, everything would burn. I whispered, Either way, I lose. The ceiling didn't argue. My phone went silent. The house breathed around me. I clenched my fists and said, I won't run. I didn't know how yet. But I knew the lie was no longer mine. It had teeth now. And it was ready to bite. I closed my eyes and waited for morning. I knew sleep wouldn't come. Fear sat beside me. Guilt pressed on my chest. I whispered, This is just the beginning. The words felt true. I stayed still and listened to my heart. It beat like a warning. I knew tomorrow would demand a choice. And I wasn't ready. But time wouldn't wait. I swallowed and stared into the dark. My silence felt louder than any shout. I understood the cost now. And it terrified me. I stayed awake, counting breaths, waiting for consequences. I felt them. I woke up to Laura's voice shaking behind me. Is this you? I turned and saw her phone in her hand. The video played again. Emily's voice rang out. My husband, she said. Laura asked, Do you have another life? I opened my mouth. I didn't answer fast enough. That pause crushed us. Laura laughed once, sharp and broken. She said, I trusted you. I said, It's not what you think. She replied, Then tell me what it is. I looked away. My silence answered for me. She stepped back like I had hit her. Emily posted again that morning. Daniel texted, She's doubling down. I watched the comments explode. Emily wrote, Forever with my husband. My hand shook. I whispered, She doesn't care. Laura said, You let her do this. I tried to explain. I said, I was scared. Laura asked, Of what? I said, Losing you. She replied, You already did. Ethan stood in the doorway. He asked, Mom, what's wrong? Laura swallowed hard. She said, Pack a bag. Lucas started crying. Mia wrapped her arms around my leg. She whispered, Don't fight. I crouched and said, Daddy's sorry? Laura turned away. My phone buzzed. Sarah Collins typed, Call me. I stepped outside and answered. She said, Emily plans to keep you. I asked, What does that mean? Sarah replied, She needs you for her story. I said, I have a family. Sarah whispered, She doesn't care. I closed my eyes. Laura walked past me with bags. She said, We need space. I followed and said, Please? She answered, Not now. The door shut. The lock clicked. The house went quiet. I slid to the floor. I said, I lost everything. No one argued. I stared at the wall. Emily texted, We're trending. I threw the phone aside. I thought she never loved me. I thought I was just a role. The truth finally settled. I whispered, I chose wrong. The silence stayed. I pressed my hands to my face. I saw my kids leaving again. I said, "This is my fault." The house didn't forgive me. I sat there until dark fell. I admitted it then. I had nothing left. I let the truth speak. I had lost everything that mattered. I stayed on the floor. I said, "This is real." My chest hurt. I remembered Daniel's warning. I ignored it. Now it was too late. I heard Ethan call my name outside. Laura answered for him. She said, "Get in the car." The engine started. The sound faded. I felt my heart break again. I said, "I failed you." No one heard. I stood slowly. I looked at empty rooms. I said, "I did this." The echo answered back. I picked up the phone. I deleted Emily's number. It didn't help. I sat again. I said, "I was weak." The words hurt. I thought of my kids sleeping elsewhere. I thought of Laura's face closing off. I knew there was no excuse. I said, "I broke us." The truth stayed. I wiped my face. I stood and locked the door. I didn't know why. I said, "I am alone." The word fit. I walked to the bedroom. The bed was cold. I sat on the edge. I said, "This is the end." I knew it wasn't. It was worse. It was the beginning. I lay back. I stared up. I said, "I lost my family." The words didn't change. I closed my eyes. I saw the door closing again. I whispered, "Everything is gone." The silence agreed. I stayed still. I accepted it. I finally understood the cost. I had nothing left to lose. I breathed slowly. I felt empty. I said, "This is my punishment." The night held me. I didn't fight it. I let the quiet stay. I knew tomorrow would hurt more. I stayed there anyway. I had nowhere else to go. I sat with the truth. It was heavy. I slept on one side of the bed and woke up on the couch. I didn't remember moving. My phone showed missed calls from Emily. I answered the next one. She snapped, "Why aren't you supporting me?" I said, "You ruined my life." She laughed and replied, "You're overreacting." I whispered, "My family left." She said, "That's not my problem." Something in me went cold. I stopped eating real meals. Daniel noticed. He said, "You look empty." I answered, "I feel worse." He asked, "What does she want now?" I said, "Control." Emily called again and said, "Stand with me or I tell my version." I asked, "What version?" She replied, "The one where you're guilty." I realized she was serious. She sent me to meet Mark Reynolds. He shook my hand like I was a contract. He said, "You belong to our image." I said, "I'm a person." Mark smiled and replied, "Not right now." Emily watched, pleased. I said, "This is wrong." She answered, "This is business." I finally saw her clearly. Love was never part of it. Daniel warned me later. He said, "They'll crush you if you let them." I asked, "What if I fight back?" He said, "Then you protect your kids." I said, "I might destroy her." Daniel replied, "She's destroying you already." His words stayed. Emily texted, "Be loyal." I typed, "I can't." She responded, "You owe me." I said out loud, "I owe my family." The apartment felt empty. I stared at the wall and replayed every mistake. Each memory hurt. I said, "This is my fault." No one argued. Mark called and said, "Don't be stupid." I replied, "Stop threatening me." He laughed. "You're replaceable." That scared me. Emily followed with, "Choose wisely." I sat on the floor and held my head. I thought of Laura packing bags. I thought of my kids asking questions I couldn't answer. Daniel came over. He said, "You can't hide forever." I asked, "What if I speak?" He said, "Then things burn." I whispered, "I'm afraid." He answered, "Good." I laughed weakly. I said, "Revenge crossed my mind." Daniel went quiet. He said, "Be careful." I nodded. The thought scared me. I wasn't that man. Or maybe I was becoming him. Emily sent one last message. "Stand by me or I ruin you." I replied, "You already did." My hands shook. I felt small. I felt angry. I felt awake. I said, "I won't be owned." The silence felt different now. I lay back and stared at the ceiling. I said, "This is rock bottom." The words didn't scare me anymore. I knew staying silent meant losing my family forever. Speaking up meant war. I closed my eyes and whispered, "I choose them." The choice hurt. It also felt right. I stood and looked at myself in the mirror. I said, "You did this." Then I added, "You can end it." I didn't know how yet. I only knew I wouldn't disappear quietly. Emily wanted obedience. Mark wanted control. I wanted my life back. I sat down and breathed slowly. I said, no more silence. The thought of revenge still scared me. But losing my kids scared me more. I picked up my phone and turned it face down. I said, tomorrow changes everything. The room stayed quiet. I stayed awake. I was done falling. I asked Laura to meet me at the park. She stood across from me and said, say what you came to say. I said, I lied and I hid and I hurt you. She crossed her arms. I said, I'm not here to beg. She asked, then why are you here? I answered, to tell the truth. She said nothing. I took a breath and said, Emily used me. I let her. Laura said, you chose her. I replied, I chose fear. She looked away. I said, I failed as a husband and a father. Laura whispered, I know. That hurt worse than shouting. She asked, is it over? I said, yes. She asked, completely? I nodded. She said, I don't forgive you. I said, I don't expect you to. She studied my face and said, but I'll listen. That felt like mercy. I told her everything. I didn't defend myself. I said, I was weak. Laura said, you were selfish. I agreed. She asked, why now? I said, because silence almost destroyed us. She said, it already did. I swallowed and said, I'm trying to save what's left. She didn't promise anything. After I met Sarah in a quiet cafe. She whispered, Emily cycles men. I asked, how many? She said, enough. I asked, why help me? She replied, because I'm tired of lying. She slid her phone over and said, messages, recordings, timelines. I stared and said, this is everything. She nodded. Sarah said, she plans narratives. I asked, including me? She answered, especially you. I felt cold. I said, I won't be silent. Sarah said, be careful. I replied, I already lost everything. She sighed and said, then do it right. I spent nights organizing proof. I listened to Emily's voice bragging. I replayed threats. I labeled dates. I said, this isn't revenge. Then I paused. I admitted, part of me wants her to hurt. That scared me. I said, truth first. I repeated it until it felt real. Daniel checked in. He asked, how are you holding up? I said, focused. He said, that's new. I replied, shame got me nowhere. He said, resolve will. I nodded. Laura texted, the kids miss you. I replied, I miss them more. She wrote, slowly. I answered, I understand. I put the phone down and said, I will earn this. No one applauded. I didn't need them to. I looked at my reflection and said, you choose now. I chose truth. I chose action. I chose my family. The fear was still there, but it no longer owned me. I said, I'm done being passive. The words stayed. For the first time, so did I. Sarah later called. She said, Emily is suspicious. I asked, of what? She replied, of you changing. I said, good. Sarah warned, she will strike first. I answered, I'm ready. Emily texted, we need to talk. I replied, we're done. She sent, you can't leave. I said, watch me. My hands shook but my voice felt steady. I said, this ends now. Daniel called again. He asked, are you sure? I said, no. He said, are you committed? I answered, yes. He replied, then I'm with you. I said, thank you. The word mattered. I walked home and said out loud, I choose my kids. The hallway echoed. I imagined telling Ethan the truth. I imagined Lucas forgiving me slowly. I imagined Mia smiling again. I said, I'll be patient. The promise felt heavy but right. That night I organized files and whispered, facts don't lie. I stopped shaking. I felt clear. I said, I won't hide anymore. The fear didn't vanish but it shrank. I closed my laptop and said, tomorrow I move forward. I slept without running. I woke early and said, I will face this. I brewed coffee and said, no more excuses. I texted Laura, I'm doing this right. She replied, we'll see. I accepted that. I stood straighter and said, this is my line. I didn't cross it. I held. I breathed and said, resolve is quiet. I stayed with it, steady, choosing action over fear. Finally, that decision became mine, unshakable and real. I meant it completely now. I stopped appearing beside Emily. At first she laughed. She said, "You're busy now?" I replied, "I'm stepping back." Her smile tightened. She said, "You don't step back from me." I said nothing. That silence scared her. She called again and said, "People are asking questions." I answered, "Let them." She snapped, "You're betraying me." I almost laughed. I said, "You taught me how." Rumors started without my help. Daniel told me, "They're whispering." I asked, "About her?" He said, "About everything." I stayed quiet. Emily called, pacing, breath sharp. She said, "Say something public." I replied, "No," she shouted, "You owe me loyalty." I answered, "I owe myself truth." She hung up. Mark stopped returning her calls. He sent me one message. "This isn't worth it." I didn't reply. I watched from a distance as her confidence cracked. Interviews got shorter. Smiles looked forced. Emily texted, "Fix this." I typed, "I won't lie." She replied, "You're ruining me." I whispered, "You did that." She cornered me after a meeting. She said, "You promised." I said, "I promised nothing." She said, "I made you." I answered, "You used me." Her eyes flashed. She said, "You're nothing without me." I felt calm. I said, "Watch." That scared her. At home, Laura let the kids visit. Ethan asked, "Are you okay now?" I said, "I'm trying." Lucas said, "Mom says you're being honest." I nodded. Mia ran to me and wrapped her arms tight. She said, "Don't disappear." I held her and said, "I'm here." My voice cracked. That hug nearly broke me. Emily accused me publicly. She posted, "Some men fear strong women." Daniel showed me. He asked, "You good?" I said, "Strangely, yes." The hollow feeling stayed, but strength filled the gaps. I didn't respond. Silence worked better than denial. Mark released a statement distancing himself. Emily spiraled. She called and screamed, "You planned this." I replied, "I chose truth." She said, "You're cruel." I said, "I'm done." She went quiet. That silence felt earned. Laura watched me carefully. She said, "You're different." I asked, "Better?" She replied, "Present." That mattered more. I told her, "I won't chase revenge." She said, "Good." I added, "But I won't hide." She nodded once. I realized revenge wouldn't heal me. Watching her fall didn't bring joy. It brought closure. Silence, though, would destroy everything I was rebuilding. I said out loud, "I'll face this." The words felt solid. Emily sent one last message. "Meet me." I replied, "Soon." My hands didn't shake. I knew the final confrontation was coming. I wasn't afraid anymore. I stood by the window and said, "I'm ready." The world didn't argue. I stayed steady, quiet, and prepared to end this honestly. I breathed and felt the shift. Her empire cracked. I stood outside it, whole enough to walk forward. The room buzzed with voices and cameras. Emily stood at the podium and said, "Thank you for believing in me." I stayed near the back. A reporter asked, "Where is your husband?" Emily smiled too fast and said, "He supports me." I didn't move. Sarah stepped forward instead. She said, "I resign." The room froze. Emily turned and hissed, "What are you doing?" Sarah raised her phone and said, "Telling the truth." Screens lit up. Messages appeared. Dates. Threats. Lies. I heard gasps. I felt my chest loosen. I didn't speak. I watched. A reporter asked, "Is this real?" Sarah said, "Every word." Emily shook her head and said, "He betrayed me." She pointed at me. I met her eyes and said quietly, "I chose honesty." That was all. Mark Reynolds stepped back. He said, "I'm done." Cameras caught it. Emily reached for him and said, "You can't leave." Mark replied, "You lied to me too." He walked away. The power shifted in that moment. I felt it. Emily faced me again. She said, "You ruined my life." I answered, "You built it on lies." She said, "I made you." I replied, "You used me." Reporters leaned in. I stayed calm. I let evidence speak. I let silence work. A journalist asked me, "Why now?" I said, "Truth doesn't wait forever." Emily cried. She said, "He abandoned me." Sarah responded, "He escaped." The room murmured. Emily's story cracked. I felt relief, not joy. I felt light, not proud. I wasn't winning. I was free. Emily looked smaller. She said, "You promised." I said, I promised nothing false. She shook her head and said, "You're heartless." I answered, "I found my heart." Security stepped closer. Emily shouted, "This is a setup." A reporter said, "The files are verified." Emily's voice broke. She said, "Say something." I said, "I already did." That ended it. Phones buzzed. Headlines wrote themselves. I stayed still. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I breathed. Sarah handed in her badge and said, "I'm done lying." I nodded once. Mark didn't look back. Emily tried again. She said, "You owe me loyalty." I said, "I owe my family." That landed. Cameras clicked harder. The narrative turned. I felt the rope loosen around my chest. A reporter asked, "Do you regret it?" I said, "I regret staying silent." Emily covered her face. She whispered, "You destroyed me." I said, "You destroyed yourself." It wasn't cruel. It was true. The event collapsed. People left. Emily stood alone. She looked at me and said, "I loved you." I replied, "You loved control." She flinched. I felt sad. I felt done. Outside, Daniel called. He said, "It's over." I said, "It's done." He asked, "How do you feel?" I answered, "Free." My voice surprised me. Laura texted. I saw. I replied, I stayed quiet. She wrote, "That mattered." I closed my eyes. Relief washed through me. I hadn't won her back. I had earned a chance. Emily exited with no escort. She said, "You'll regret this." I said, "I regret nothing true." She turned away. The cameras followed someone else now. I stood alone and breathed. The power balance had flipped. I wasn't controlled. I wasn't owned. I wasn't afraid. I walked out without looking back. I said to myself, "This ends here." The words held. I stepped into daylight lighter than I had been in months. I didn't celebrate. I moved on. I didn't expect her to call. My phone buzzed and the screen showed her name. I hesitated, then answered. "Nathan," she whispered, voice small. I said, "Emily." Silence stretched. Finally she said, "Can we meet?" I asked, "Why?" She sniffled, I need to explain." I agreed quietly. We met in a quiet cafe. She slid into the seat across from me. Her eyes were red. I said, "You look awful." She whispered, "I've never felt this before." I nodded. "Neither have I," I said. Emily's voice broke. "I didn't know it would end like this." I asked, "And like what?" She said, "Everything, me, us, my career." I stayed quiet. She looked at me and said, "I'm sorry, Nathan." I said nothing. She added, I ruined everything." Tears ran down her cheeks. She said, "I thought I loved you." I looked at her and said, "Love built on lies always collapses." Her face paled. She whispered, "Did you ever love me?" I took a breath. "I cared," I said, "but it wasn't love. Not the way you think." She blinked, stunned. "How could you?" she asked. I said, "Because I love truth, not your games." She shook her head. "I didn't mean to hurt you," she said, voice cracking. I leaned back. "Intentions don't erase consequences." She looked away. "I thought we were real," she murmured. I said, "Real is honesty. We were never honest." Emily leaned forward. "Nathan, please say something. Anything." I said, "I can't fix this for you." She whispered, "Then what do I do?" I answered, "Face it. Own it. Stop blaming others." She cried harder. "You make it sound so easy," she said. I shook my head. "It's not easy, but it's true." She begged, "Do you hate me?" I said, "I don't feel hate. I feel distance." She swallowed hard. "Distance hurts," she said. I replied, "It's meant to. Lies hurt more than anger ever could." She trembled. "I thought you'd fight for me," she said. I whispered, "I fight for what's real, not illusions." She sobbed quietly. I said, "This is over, Emily." She looked up, desperate. "Please, Nathan." I shook my head. "Please nothing. You already had the chance to be honest." Her shoulders slumped. She nodded, silent. I stood. She reached out. "Don't go," she said. I looked at her hand, then past it. "I have to," I said. She whispered, "Will you ever forgive me?" I replied, "Forgiveness isn't for you to ask. It's for those you hurt." She didn't speak. I walked away slowly. Each step felt heavy but necessary. She called my name once and I didn't look back. I didn't run. I just walked. Outside I breathed in the cold air. I said to myself, it's done. The cafe faded behind me. I felt no relief, no triumph, just distance, the kind that protects. I whispered, truth hurts more than lies. My feet moved steadily forward. I didn't glance back. I didn't need to. Every step reminded me why I chose honesty. Every heartbeat reminded me why I left. I kept walking, and the weight of her regret stayed behind. I said quietly, this is the end of her story with me. The street ahead was empty, and I let it be. I didn't look back again. I kept walking. I knew some truths are too heavy to carry but necessary to leave behind. I whispered once more, goodbye, Emily. And I finally meant it. Laura called and said, they'll be here in an hour. I nodded even though she couldn't see me. I said, I'll be ready. Ethan and Lucas ran in first, shouting, Dad. I knelt down. Hey guys, I said. Lucas asked, can we play? I replied, of course. Mia stayed close to Laura at first. I said softly, come here, Mia. She hesitated, then ran into my arms. Laura watched quietly. She said, don't push them. I whispered, I won't. Ethan asked, can we read together? I smiled. Let's do that. Lucas asked, what about dinner? I said, we'll figure it out. The questions were small, normal, and somehow heavy. Daniel called while I read with Ethan. He asked, how's it going? I said, slow but good. He said, growth isn't dramatic, Nathan. Quiet steps matter. I leaned back and said, I keep forgetting that. He laughed softly. Patience, man. Patience rebuilds more than speed ever could. I nodded, thinking about all I had broken. Mia climbed onto my lap. She whispered, I missed you. I held her tighter. I missed you too, I said. Ethan peeked over the book. Are you really staying? I answered, I'm here. Always. Lucas put down his toys. Promise? I said, I promise. Their small voices, their trust, it felt like fragile glass. I thought about how easily it could shatter again. Laura finally spoke. They're responding to you. I nodded. I'll keep trying. She said, just keep showing up. I whispered, I will. The room felt calm. Not safe yet, but quieter. Healing wasn't loud. It was careful, measured. Later I watched them play. I whispered to myself, this is what matters. No cameras, no applause. Just me, them, and the silence filled with small joys. Daniel's words repeated in my head. Growth isn't dramatic. I said, it's true. I made tea. I asked, do you want cookies? Ethan cheered, yes. Lucas grinned. Mia giggled. I said, slow steps, right? She laughed. Yes, Daddy. I smiled, feeling the warmth in their voices. I sat alone after they left. Laura said, thank you for today. I replied, I'll keep doing it. She nodded. It's a start. I whispered, it's all I have. I thought about the man I was before. I said quietly, I may never get that back. But I added, I can be better. Responsibility didn't feel like a weight anymore. It felt like a guide. I looked at the empty living room. I whispered, being a man isn't for the applause. The silence agreed. I added, it's for when no one is watching. I poured another cup of tea and said, I'll keep walking this path. Quiet, steady, patient. No grand gestures, no declarations. Just me and the truth of who I want to be. I closed my eyes and whispered, I'll get there. Slowly, quietly. And I meant it. I stood at the back of the school auditorium, hidden behind a row of chairs. Ethan was on stage holding a trophy. Lucas waved at him. Mia clutched my hand tightly. I whispered, I'm here. She squeezed harder. I said, always. Laura stood nearby, her eyes on the kids. She didn't look at me. I whispered, I don't expect anything. She nodded slightly. That was enough. Ethan shouted, Dad. I waved discreetly. Lucas giggled and said, we see you. Mia whispered, don't go. I said softly, I won't. The little voices felt like anchors. I remembered everything, Emily, the lies, the public chaos. I whispered, karma didn't punish her. I thought about her calls, her tears, her rage. I realized quietly, I freed myself. The truth lifted a weight I hadn't known I carried. Daniel had told me, being a man isn't about fighting others. It's about being honest when no one's watching. I nodded now. I said aloud, I understand. Mia tugged at my sleeve. Clap with us. I whispered, of course. We clapped softly, careful not to draw attention. Ethan glanced at me and smiled. Lucas elbowed me gently. The warmth from them felt stronger than any applause I had ever received. Laura whispered to Ethan, "Your dad is proud." I stayed quiet. I didn't need to speak. My presence said enough. Lucas leaned against my leg. I said softly, "I'm proud of you too." He grinned and said, "I know." I thought about the life I lost and the life I was building. I whispered, "I'm not fully forgiven." I added, "I'm not fully healed." But I also said, "I'm honest." That counts for something. The words rang in the quiet auditorium. A teacher passed and smiled at the kids. Ethan waved. Lucas waved back. I smiled faintly. I said quietly, "I'll keep showing up no matter what." That small commitment felt heavier than any declaration of victory. Mia whispered, "Stay?" I said, "I'm staying." She giggled softly. I realized that quiet moments like this mattered more than public triumphs. I whispered, "This is enough for now." I thought about Emily again. Her empire, her lies, her desperation. I whispered, "I don't need her downfall to move forward." Relief filled me, soft and steady. I said, "I only need my truth." Laura glanced at me. I said, "I won't ruin it again." She nodded briefly. That acknowledgement, small as it was, felt like a seed of trust. Ethan waved again, shouting, "Dad, look at me." I whispered, "I'm looking." Lucas leaned into my side. Mia's hand stayed in mine. I said, "This is what matters." I stood there quiet, watching them. I whispered, "I choose to be this man. Not perfect, not whole, but honest. Not flashy, not applauded, but real." The stage lights glowed on my children. I whispered again, "This is enough for now." And it truly was.